So now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our August edition of the Inside Track webinar as we head into the 2022 midterms. As always, we have a lot of fresh public opinion data to share with you about how the American people are responding to the myriad events that are facing the country. We'll try to go through as much of it as possible here today. We always welcome any questions people have. You can submit those at any time using the app, the Q&A function in the app, if you have any questions, and I will try to reserve some time at the end of the presentation to go through those and answer those. Also, all of this material is public data. It's all actually on the Ipsos website. So any of this that you're interested in finding, looking at for yourself, you can certainly check out ipsos.com to see the full surveys that we're pulling bits and pieces from. And likewise, like Ellen said, that this deck and this webinar will be posted on the Ipsos website for your perusal in the future if you so desire. So let's get started though. Like I said, crowded agenda today. We're going to talk about the main issue facing the country. This is, what the public thinks the main issues are, and then dig into a number of those different issues, starting with the economy, going into crime and gun violence, abortion, the recently signed Inflation Reduction Act, which is maybe not totally accurately named, and then finishing up on our sort of latest information about the elections, the midterm elections, which are starting to come into a little bit more focused as we head into the fall. Traditionally, sort of Labor Day and after is when the election really heats up in a midterm cycle. So we're really starting to get close to that period. So first off, the main issue. This is from our 538 Ipsos tracking program. Every month we're going to about 2,000 Americans, asking them what their main concerns are. And we actually asked them 3 questions: what they think the biggest problem for the country is, what they're most worried about personally, and what they see in the news media. And we're showing you what they're worried about personally right now. And you can see that inflation and increasing costs continues to be the dominant issue, with 60% of Americans listing it as one of their top 3 worries. After that, crime or gun violence and political extremism or polarization sort of are in the next tier. There's been a little bit of movement from May to August in those numbers, but they're pretty close to a tie. After that, climate change, which has increased a fair bit from July. I would attribute that really to some of the heat waves we experienced in the country through sort of July. And then sort of all the other issues that, 1 in 7, 1 in 8 Americans or fewer list as one of their main concerns. And you may see those and be like, well, those aren't really things that are going to shape the agenda, but you do have to remember that even sort of issues that a relative minority feel are important can be impactful if it's a focused enough issue for that group of people, right? So for instance, immigration, 14%. That's not a huge number in terms of the whole population, but immigration is a very important issue with Republicans. It's very mobilizing and has an undue impact on sort of electoral outcomes because of how important immigration is as an issue to that group. On the other side, abortion, particularly after the Dobbs ruling from the Supreme Court that overturned the national right to an abortion that was established in the Roe decision a few decades ago. Abortion is a much higher concern among Democrats, is a much more salient and powerful factor among Democratic voters than the perhaps 11% overall would suggest. But I think the main thing to take away from this is still that inflation and increasing cost is by far the dominant issue heading into the midterms. That is sort of the fundamental gravity that will be driving the election. That sort of everything else will be orbiting around. Now, this survey was conducted in late July and early August. So we'd seen gas prices starting to come down at that time. They have continued to cool off, and we will see in our next wave of this survey, which will be released just after Labor Day, if perhaps inflation increasing costs is not quite the same level of concern, if people are starting to feel a little bit more okay about pricing pressures now that they seem to have stabilized a little bit, but that might also not stay true. So let's go into some of these issues. First off, with the economy, this is our consumer confidence index, the Ipsos Consumer Confidence Index. We've shared this with you in the past. We've been tracking this since 2002. It was actually the first research program I worked on when I joined Ipsos. I've been working with this program for over 15 years now. And right now, American consumer confidence is actually somewhat stable and has been somewhat stable for about a month now through the summer. Basically, ever since we saw gas prices sort of peak and start coming down, consumer confidence has really been sort of at the same place, just below the 50 threshold. Now, this index, it's an index, so these numbers don't actually mean anything in and of themselves, but we can see the historical average for American consumer confidence has been somewhere around 55. So we're actually a little bit below the historical average. But we certainly aren't at the pits that we saw in consumer confidence during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, where it really sort of dropped out. And indeed, even during the pandemic era, when we saw those really dramatic declines in consumer confidence right after the lockdown started in 2000 and 2020, it never actually got quite so low. So, the American consumer right now is in a place of not necessarily happy, not necessarily comfortable, but certainly not in a place of sort of abject panic like we saw during the Great Recession, or even the level we saw sort of in April of 2020, immediately after the start of the pandemic. And partially that is because of this delinking of pricing pressures and job security. Job security has always been sort of the foundational piece of our consumer confidence trend tracker. It is the set of numbers that tends to move the least. And you can see here that it's actually sort of delinked a little bit from some of the more cost-sensitive measures, and that we're in this one, we're using the measure people's comfort with their ability to make other household purchases. That's affording, things like toilet paper, or groceries, or just all the basic sort of things you need to have your household. And these numbers were really very much in lockstep at the beginning of the pandemic through last summer, and then as inflation sort of kicked in, we saw them really diverge with people's household purchase comfort dropping much faster than their job security comfort. And indeed, if we actually look at a different question about actual reported job loss, that number is even more positive for Americans. So, even while people are a little bit uncomfortable about their job security, probably because of the broader sort of economic news and economic environment, we're actually seeing very few people, relatively speaking, reporting that they've actually lost a job or someone in their immediate circle has lost a job. So unlike in 2008, 2009, where job losses were actually very significant and widespread, this time the job losses aren't really happening so much. So it's really much more in that price pressure is what's driving that sort of consumer confidence, which is limiting the extent to which it can fall, right? Because essentially only one of the two main legs that consumer sentiment is built on has been weakened over the last 9-10 months, while the other leg has sort of remained relatively stable, sort of cushioning consumer sentiment overall, which again isn't to say that consumer sentiment is good. It's certainly not. But it has been, I think, sort of softened a little bit because people haven't been losing their jobs. But at the same time, we do see that the impact of the inflationary period has not necessarily been felt equally across all facets of society. In fact, the impact of the pandemic period has not been felt equally. This is looking at making major household purchases. So this is sort of larger things like appliances or cars. And one thing that really becomes apparent is that low-income households with a total income of $50,000 or less, never really recovered dramatically during the pandemic period. So they sort of dropped down to 27 immediately at the start of it. They recovered back up to something in the 30s, saying that they were comfortable with that. And then they sort of slid back down to about 27 in our most recent wave. So really, their sentiments, their sort of attitudes hasn't really changed. They've been squeezed all along during the pandemic. It's certainly gotten worse in the last couple of months, but certainly hasn't gotten better. The group that did see their fortunes change most dramatically are high-income households who saw their household major purchase comfort almost more than double from the beginning of the pandemic to sort of last summer, and then has seen the biggest declines during the inflationary period. So when you see a lot of people complaining about the pains of inflation, it's sort of being driven by these people who are feeling sort of the most change, even if they're not necessarily the people who are feeling the greatest pinch. And I think that's sort of worth just keeping in mind, that, humans are sort of wired to sort of compare now versus how they were, and loss is often felt more acutely than just sort of being in misery all the time. But, the more affluent households are still actually doing a good bit better, all things equal, than the less affluent households, even though we've seen those declines. Next, crime and gun violence. So this is an issue that will likely be a pretty politically salient issue going into the midterms. Indeed, if you sort of saw Trump's recent web advertisement, he made crime a very major focal point of sort of what looked like his sort of 2024 campaign kickoff. We've seen Republicans in various ways, shapes, and forms sort of talking about crime more broadly. And then on the other hand, gun violence is a topic that Democrats have been talking about, particularly after the mass shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde, Texas, earlier this summer. So we recently did some deeper research on the topic with our 538 poll. So first off, just looking at sort of the issue, the trend line of the issue, you can see on the left, this is the main worry, the most important issue facing the country. So it's that other question in that series we ask them about rather than the personal worry. And you can see a significant increase in the amount of concern about crime or gun violence after the mass shootings, almost doubling from 23% to 42%. And then it sort of settled back down into the sort of low 30s, even while inflation has continued to be sort of the dominant issue for the country. So, we set the question up, crime or gun violence, because it's a tracking poll. We're trying to track it over time, not necessarily trying to track, people's response to specific mass shootings. And it was really more about sort of physical safety is what we're sort of trying to measure here. But with these mass shootings coming out, there was definitely an interest in being able to parse that out. So we have a question we asked in our most recent survey in August, where we actually asked Americans what they think the bigger issue is. And we saw that the majority of Americans are more worried about gun violence than crime, 55% to 35%. But partisanship has a huge impact in that sort of view, with Democrats overwhelmingly saying they're more concerned about gun violence and Republicans overwhelmingly saying they're more concerned with crime. Now, I think there's probably some semantics going on in here about how you're defining things. But, I think this does really sort of say how, even though these are both issues of physical safety, both issues of violence, the distinctions between crime and gun violence have very sort of political sensitivities that are sort of driving sort of the debate. And so when we dig in more with gun violence specifically, we do see that Americans, a majority of Americans, supermajority actually in most cases, support a lot of gun control legislation measures, including universal background checks, safety training, mental health evaluations, raising the minimum age. But there are huge partisan differences, again, with Democrats almost universally supporting these and Republicans and independents being much more cautious, much more reticent, even while majority supports in these various sort of gun control legislation aspects. And then one other just sort of data point from the survey that we found really striking, and this is more about experience. We asked if you personally had experienced active shooter drills when you were in school. This is something that happens now a lot in schools where kids are essentially trained what to do if there's an active shooter. And we broke that out by the generation of the respondent. And you can see how among Gen Z respondents, which are essentially mid-20s or younger, 2/3 of them have experienced that versus about 1/3 of millennials, who are people from their mid-20s to about 40, and then almost no Gen Xers or boomers or people in the silent generation, which are basically all the people over the age of 40. And I think this just really sort of illustrates how gun violence and mass shootings have sort of reshaped a piece of American fabric, particularly sort of this idea that, these young kids are having to go through these active shooter drills in a way that, maybe if we'd asked about duck and cover drills, nuclear bomb sort of drills, we would have seen boomers having a much more high experience of that, right? So it's just a very sort of fascinating and sobering look at how these sort of tragedies are shaping American society in a broader way. All right, other issue, abortion. So like I mentioned before, the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court striking down Roe v. Wade has really sort of shaken up the political and media landscape, but maybe hasn't necessarily shaken up the election landscape so much. But, there have been some really interesting developments here. So first off, just to sort of level set on where the country is, this is from our 538 survey that we actually fielded in late June and early July. And we can see that the American public, generally speaking, is supportive of legal abortion, both surgical abortion, which is sort of the classic version of abortion with a doctor, or medical abortion, which are typically more abortion pills. They sort of give you medicine to abort pregnancy. A majority, but not a large majority of Americans sort of supporting those. And the support is a little bit more tepid, with the number of Americans who say it should be legal in all cases just over a quarter, just under a third, depending on which one you're looking at. So, attitudes on abortion are, I think, somewhat complicated in America. They aren't necessarily one where there's a large number of people who have very clear, crystallized views. That being said, it is still 55% support to about 35% who think it should be illegal. In most or all cases. But when you sort of turn to sort of related topics like emergency contraception, like IUDs, or even birth control or condoms, we do see many more Americans are supportive of legal access to those, which I think sort of suggests sort of the hard limits, at least right now, in public opinion to sort of changing laws, despite the fact that there have been some conservatives, including Justice Clarence Thomas, who spoke a little bit about maybe that those should be put on the chopping block as well, legal guaranteed access to things like emergency contraception or birth control. So then we turn to policy areas about this. So now that Dobbs has been overturned, we're in a very sort of complicated landscape where states are making abortion laws at a state by state level. And this is, I think, where the complex American attitudes towards abortion become sort of increasingly complex and messy. For instance, we see overwhelmingly Americans oppose measures that will penalize people who get abortion or make it increasingly difficult for people to get abortion. These would be the bottom three things on the scale. So things like making it illegal to provide assistance to women getting an abortion, allowing ordinary citizens to sue people who are getting abortions, which was something that was put into place in Texas, or making it illegal for women to cross state lines to obtain an abortion. These are all areas where we see overwhelming opposition, but at the same time, Americans are very sort of lukewarm on supporting things that would make it easier to access abortion. So things like requiring health insurers to cover abortion services, only 54% support, or employees or insurance companies paying for women to travel across state lines to get abortion services in states where it's still legal, only 50% support that. So again, while there is very much a very clear shouldn't be punishing people, the idea of it should be made easier, very sort of ambivalent, very sort of unclear there. So there's, American sort of public opinion is in this place of generally should be legal, generally uncomfortable with the concept, definitely don't want to see people getting punished for it, but also maybe aren't totally sure about making it easy to access. We've done some separate research that I don't have in here that does indicate that people's knowledge level about abortion is generally relatively low. And as their sort of knowledge of abortion facts sort of increases, they do tend to be more supportive. Now, it's an open question of if that's, the tail wagging the dog there, that essentially people who already have very firm opinions are also the ones who are better informed, rather than being better informed gives you a clearer view. And then turning to finally Kansas, finally in this section, Kansas recently had a referendum where the state was allowed, the voters in the state were allowed to essentially decide about the fate of the state's abortion protections. The state had in their state laws had essentially that abortion was a legal right, people had access to it, and there was a referendum essentially saying that they would do away with that constitutional protection, and the legislature would be able to decide what the rules around abortion were. And with the Kansas state legislature being dominated by Republicans, it was pretty widely assumed that if that came to pass, they would have outlawed it. And when the actual vote happened a few weeks ago, a large majority of Kansas voters decided to keep that constitutional right in place and rejected the ballot measure that would devolve the right to the legislature, essentially protecting people's right to abortion. Was actually huge turnout in the state, almost at the level that you would see in a presidential election, which is somewhat uncharacteristic to a primary, which is essentially when this was scheduled. But when we take that question, we actually ask it to a broader slice of the American people. We actually see most Americans are in favor of having that same opportunity to register their own vote about what the future of abortion rights should be in their state. 70% of Americans, including majorities of Republicans, Democrats, and independents, saying that they would strongly or somewhat support having that kind of ballot measure in their state. And if given the opportunity, we do see that a majority say that they would vote in favor of keeping abortion legal or making abortion legal, depending on their state. 54%, only 28% say that they would vote to keep it illegal or make it illegal, again, depending on their state. And this actually, I think, relatively closely matches sort of the support for abortion overall, and does suggest, again, at sort of the biggest, most aggregate level, the American people are broadly supportive of abortion rights, even if they're also somewhat tolerant with restrictions. All right, the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is the piece of legislation that was signed into law this last Tuesday by President Biden. It is a major piece of legislation about a number of different things. Its biggest pieces were touching actually on climate and energy policy, but also had some major pieces that were touching on Medicare and prescription drug price negotiations, in addition to setting up a minimum tax rates for large corporations. Major piece of legislation, interestingly enough, has already actually fallen off of the news cycle, considering how large it is. It was passed on Tuesday, got a good number of headlines yesterday. Today, almost nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a few bits, continues to dominate the media's attention. And I think fundamentally, this is sort of the problem with the contemporary American news industry, is that they will spend 2 weeks talking about the FBI going to Mar-a-Lago to see some documents, even with no actual new information, and then spend a day talking about the largest piece of climate legislation in American history. Priorities, right? But anyways, the American people don't really know a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act. I think, speaking to what I was just talking about, this is from some research we did with Reuters actually before it was passed, and we found that essentially only a little over 1 in 3 Americans, or 2 in 5 rather, were familiar with what was in the bill. Partisans a little bit more knowledgeable than independents, but still not huge numbers. I wouldn't actually expect this to have changed dramatically because, again, it's not getting a lot of attention. And when we asked people about their attitudes about the Inflation Reduction Act, if they supported it or opposed it, we found that basically only about half of Americans said that they supported it. When we first asked about it, we then provided them a little bit more information, including that it was being supported by the Democratic Party and opposed by the Republican Party. We saw virtually the same level of support when we did that, but a much more partisan split in the support level, which I think just speaks to the power of polarization, where it doesn't really matter what the thing is. If your team supports it, you support it. If your team opposes it, you oppose it. The actual nuts and bolts of the policy don't actually matter. And I say that because when we actually ask about a lot of the policies that are in the bill, we find that they are broadly pretty popular. So in the same Reuters Ipsos survey, we asked people support or oppose various policies, including allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices with pharmaceutical companies. 71% of Americans say they support that. Providing incentives to lower the cost of all forms of renewable energy, 65% support that. Extending health insurance subsidies for middle-income people getting insurance with the ACA, making it more difficult for investors to take advantage of capital gains loopholes, which actually ended up getting struck. Increasing the corporate minimum tax rate to 15% on businesses with $1 billion a year in profits, 61% support that. And even government funds to encourage oil and gas companies to reduce methane emissions, 58% supporting that. We also, it's not in this chart, but we also even asked about if people support or oppose giving more funding to the IRS to increase enforcement on people who don't pay their taxes. And we found a majority of Americans supported that as well. So it was interesting that, even though the bill as a total, when we say, do you support or oppose the Inflation Reduction Act, not even 50% say yes, each of the individual pieces were actually broadly popular. And we actually found this to be true of a lot of major legislation over the last decade and a half, where even if the pieces of the legislation are really important or not important, are really popular, the overall top line opinion of the legislation tends to just break down along party lines. Which I think just speaks to, again, the power of partisanship, but also that most Americans aren't actually paying that much attention to what's in the bill, even if there is a lot of news coverage to tell them, right? Which, again, in this case, I don't think there actually has been. All right, so finally the election. So it is August, the election's a little over 2 months away. It's starting to really sort of take shape. We're starting to really see who the candidates are going to be. And I think there's a lot of interesting things sort of happening here. So first off, this is the Ipsos generic congressional ballot from our survey with 538. We actually saw in July a little bit of a movement towards the Democrats. So you have on front of you all Americans on one side and people who are likely, they're certain to vote on the other. Republicans have had the advantage this year pretty consistently on this question. Oh, and the generic congressional ballot is essentially the way we get around the difficulty of asking about all 435 congressional seats in a survey. Instead, we ask, in the upcoming election, would you intend to vote for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate? It's not a perfect match to how the congressional elections will come out, but it is generally a good sort of thermometer for sort of where the things are going to go. The party that leads on the generic congressional ballot tends to also be the one that wins the most seats, wins the majority. Though Republicans do have a little bit of an advantage due to redistricting, where Democrats probably need a 2 or 3 point advantage in the generic congressional ballot in order to sort of break even in the terms of the total number of seats. But anyways, as I was speaking, we saw in July actually the ballot actually moved towards the Democrats a bit. This was after the Dobbs decision came out. And we saw among all Americans, it sort of moved into a tie, and among certain voters, it actually moved into a point Democratic advantage. However, since then, we've seen that number among certain voters sort of fade away a little bit, and we've seen Republicans sort of reestablish sort of their leading position +2 in our most recent wave, which again happened in early August. And I think that's really just sort of the fundamentals reasserting themselves. You know, this is a midterm election cycle. In 19 out of 20 of the last midterm elections, the party outside of the White House has picked up seats. That would be the Republican Party this year. And honestly, I think that's likely to happen this year. I think, you know, people just sort of get a little tired of the governing party, especially when things are maybe not good, if the economy's maybe not doing very well, if inflation's going up, if people feel like, you know, there's a number of problems that are not being addressed. Now, this is data, again, from early August. So we don't necessarily know yet if the recent news about the FBI search at Mar-a-Lago is going to have an effect. I don't think it really will. We don't also know if the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act is going to have a big effect. I don't think it really will. Or if the continuing decrease in gas prices will have an effect, which I think might actually have a little bit, though not a huge impact. And why is this sort of happening? Well, fundamentally, it is because Republicans have maintained a bit of an enthusiasm advantage versus Democrats. So this is, again, from that same 538 poll. We asked people, how likely are you to vote in the midterm elections? Are you certain or almost certain? Are you very likely? Are you somewhat or not likely? And you can see that 56% of Republicans in August said that they were certain or almost certain, compared to only 48% of Democrats. And while there are, generally speaking, more Democrats in this country, more people who identify as Democrats in this country, Republicans with this sort of turnout advantage are essentially making up the difference, because it doesn't matter if there's more of them, it matters how many of them actually show up to vote. And Republicans seem like they're more mobilized, more likely to show up to vote than Democrats are, where you can actually see sort of just over half of Democrats are not certain to vote at this time. Now, you know, those people who say they're very likely, many of them probably will still show up to vote, but I think it just is a good indicator of that sort of relative certainty. And this is the data from a number of different sources, the analysis rather, from a number of different sources about what people expect for the House. Lots of experts are spending lots of time sort of modeling out what they expect to happen. You can see the specific outlet along the side there from 538, who we do polling with a lot, to the Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, Sabata's Crystal Ball, Politico, the news outlet, Real Clear Politics, Fox News, or Decision Desk HQ. And they all basically are at the same place, where they think that the Republicans are likely to take control of the House currently held by Democrats. They're likely to get at least 218 seats, which is what's required to get that majority. And you can see the actual sort of outcomes that they're predicting on the slide in front of you. And on average, essentially, if you average all these people up, they're sort of saying that Democrats are likely to end up around 196 seats. Republicans are likely to end up with 214 seats, and there's 25 seats that are toss-ups that could go either way. Again, Republicans only need to get to 218, so essentially they would just need to win 4 of those toss-up seats to take the majority. It doesn't mean that it's a guarantee that they're going to win, but it does seem pretty likely that they're going to be able to take the majority, at least given where things are right now. Then turning to the Senate actually is becoming a little bit more of an interesting case. So the battlegrounds in the Senate races are expanding. About a third of the Senate is up for re-election this year. And there have been a number of races that were thought to have been safe Republican races that are looking like they may actually be a little bit more competitive. Now, that doesn't mean they actually will be competitive at the end of the day. Remember, it's just August. The election's a couple of months away. But at least at this moment in time, they're looking like they may be a little bit more competitive, and the map has widened or expanded a little bit. And particularly, we've included Ohio and Florida in this month as potential battleground states, contested battleground states, where we had previously thought of them as relatively safe Republican seats. So what's happening in each one of these? So again, this is the sort of the list of these. And you can see that the Democrats are actually looking surprisingly not terrible in these Senate races. At the beginning of the year, we sort of thought that they were likely to lose most, if not all, of these races. But there's a number of them, and number of these races in which Democrats are actually ahead at the moment. So in Arizona, incumbent Mark Kelly seems to be leading Republican Blake Masters by a decent margin. We have this is the average, the poll average from 538 in Real Clear Politics. Those two outlets use different methodologies for determining their average. 538 basically includes every poll that's published, but then they have their own sort of thing they add to it to sort of normalize polls out and sort of, they like add some points or subtract some points to each poll that sort of adjust for house effects. So it's a sort of a modeled average versus Real Clear Politics, which is much more of a straight average, 2 plus 2 equals 4 divided by 2 kind of thing. But they're weird about which polls they include and which ones they don't include. It doesn't seem to have a whole lot of rhyme or reason to which ones they include. So while it's mathematically a more simple average, it's not necessarily as complete a picture sometimes as 538, which is presenting a more complicated model. But anyways, I just recommend looking at both, honestly. So Arizona, the Democrats doing well. In Florida, Marco Rubio, the incumbent there, is still a likely winner, but Val Demings, the Democratic challenger, has actually gotten that into single digits, which to our eye makes it at least interesting to watch, even if the Republican will probably end up winning. In Georgia, which is probably still going to be the most close election, incumbent Democrat Raphael Warnock facing former Georgia football great Herschel Walker. That race is pretty close to a tie right now, though it has been trending a little bit towards the Democrats in recent weeks. In Nevada, again, a very close race, probably the second closest after Georgia. Democratic incumbent Catherine Cortez Masto, very, very small lead over Adam Laxalt. I'd call that a tie, honestly. And then in New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan, Democratic incumbent, seems like she's got a little bit more of a comfortable lead. North Carolina, which we thought was probably a pretty Republican-leaning state, looks like it's actually kind of close, only about +2, +3 Republican overall. So that's definitely one to watch. And then Ohio, where Democrat Tim Ryan is challenging Republican J.D. Vance for an open seat. Trump won Ohio by about 10 points in 2020, but Ohio also already has a Democratic senator, so they is a place that is okay with sort of the idea of ticket splitting. And J.D. Vance is not doing quite as well as we sort of expected. This race being, he has an advantage, but again, it's only a 3 to 6 point advantage. So I still think he's likely to win in Ohio, but it is definitely a race that's worth watching. But then the other one, going the other way in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz, also in an open seat. We've seen this race is really moving towards the Democrat, really moving towards Fetterman. He's not even sort of done a lot of traditional campaigning after suffering a little bit of a health scare earlier this year, and has basically run a campaign that has been mostly on social media and mostly about trolling Dr. Oz for being sort of a rich, out-of-touch New Jersey person in Pennsylvania, and has been actually quite effective at that. And I think it just goes to show how someone who has a brand that is seen as relatively authentic, like John Fetterman does, he wears cargo shorts, lots of tattoos, like very sort of middle Pennsylvania, combined with a very savvy media presence, which I think his social media team is very savvy, can sort of upend sort of traditional politics. And I think this was also something that Donald Trump sort of instinctively knew in 2016, that, a lot of times it's not really about the policy. It's not about sort of, the position paper or even sort of the history of the resume, right? It's about sort of giving out the right vibe that people in your state or your country want to vote for. And I think John Fetterman has sort of been able to really find that in Pennsylvania in a way that Mehmet Oz has really struggled to. And then Wisconsin, incumbent Republican Ron Johnson facing a pretty spirited challenge from Mandela Barnes. This was not really thought of as a seat that the Democrats were likely to win, but again, it's proving to be much closer than expected. Definitely a race to continue watching. So the Senate, which right now is 50-50, remember, looks like it could swing maybe to 53 Democrat, even to 53 Republican control, right? So there's a lot of sort of potential outcomes on the table right now from what even a few months ago looked like it was a little bit more of a sleepy Republicans are likely to win kind of situation. So where does this leave us at the end? So we've actually made a slight update for our outcomes, and we're really starting to look more at that sort of middle scenario with narrow Republican wins. We think the Republicans are likely to take control of the House. The Senate could go either way. We think the most likely outcome is 50-50 or maybe 51-49. Now, 51-49 Republican versus 51-49 Democrat, materially huge differences. But in terms of, the election outcome, we think it's probably going to be pretty close. And we think the odds of a proper red wave, massive wins for Republicans, have actually come down a little bit. Based on gas prices subsiding, which I think is helping the Democrats, based on the Republicans nominating a number of candidates who might not play as well in the general election, and the Democratic Party seemingly having found its way to actually pass some legislation and give its people something to move for, and the Dobbs decision sort of giving the Democratic base something to sort of mobilize around in a way that they haven't had in recent years. So we still think it's likely Republicans are going to pick up seats. Republicans are going to, make gains, but it's not as likely that they're going to be huge, overwhelming swings. All right, so that's it. Ready for questions. So again, use that Q&A field in the application, and let me see what we got. The relationship between generation and concerns with gun violence and crime. Yeah, there is actually a relationship, and younger people are more concerned with gun violence. Older people are more concerned with crime. It's not huge. Partisanship plays a much larger has a much larger impact in those attitudes than generation. But we do see younger people are more concerned about it, more than just would be explained by sort of younger people being more democratic. And I think that slide I showed you about how Gen Z folks, 2/3 of them have experienced active shooter drills, probably explains a little bit why. It's a much more sort of personal, much more gun violence, mass shootings. There's a much more personal, much more immediate sort of fear to younger folks who've sort of lived through this post-Columbine era than older folks who, while, rightfully terrified and horrified of it, it's a little bit more abstract, having, not actually sat through those sort of active shooter drills. All right. Let's see, what else do we got? If Trump declares his candidacy prior to the midterms, do you think that will shift voting preferences to Democrats and more moderate Republican candidates? That's a good question. It's one that a lot of people have been sort of talking about. I don't necessarily think it actually has a huge impact, honestly. I think the people that are going to be the most motivated by that are essentially already going to be voting. I do think it maybe gives the Democrats a little bit of an advantage in terms of fundraising. Democrats have been able to raise lots of money off of fear of Trump. And that may then prove to have dividends if they're able to invest that money in good ads and an effective get out the vote effort on the ground. But I think in terms of in and of itself, I don't know if Trump's announcement necessarily will move things. I do, though, think that where Trump's involvement can potentially be more impactful is in terms of sort of what's happening in the news cycle. Like we saw in the last 2 weeks, the Inflation Reduction Act, which, like I mentioned, is a huge consequential piece of legislation that has a lot of things in it that is not very well understood, was essentially entirely almost pushed off of the news landscape by the FBI search at Mar-a-Lago and Trump's sort of response to it afterwards. And Trump has, through his entire presidency and afterward, had that ability to dominate the media landscape. So, looking into the midterms, if we get into a situation where, maybe something happens that's good for the Democrats, they pass some other big piece of legislation, which isn't going to happen, but, whatever. Or maybe, there's a round of stories about how much gas prices have dropped or something else like that. And then Trump announces it's going to suck up all the oxygen. So, anything that might be a good news story for Democrats could get just squashed by Trump's involvement or not. And I think that's honestly been a challenge Democrats have not been able to really successfully answer. Going back to 2016, Hillary Clinton's campaign never really figured out how to get past Trump's ability to control the news agenda. And I think it continues to be an issue now, more so than, again, people's actual reaction to Trump being in the race or not for 2024, is the fact that, it drowns out everything else. It drowns out all other discussion in a large way, shape, or form. What impact will the FBI search at Mar-a-Lago have on the election? I don't think it will have a large one. I think Trump's been able to raise money off of it. I've seen he raised about $5 million off of it. I don't think that'll be spent on Republicans, though, so I don't think that'll have much of an impact. I definitely think it probably mobilized sort of Trump loyalists in the Republican base. And if the election were to have happened, this last Tuesday, I think it might have had an impact. But these kind of events fade over time. And I think by the time that the November election rolls around, this will have sort of faded from memory a little bit. It won't really be the thing that's driving sort of, the Republican base. There probably will be something else that will be driving the Republican base, but I don't think this necessarily will be it. Let's see. So what is the relationship between gas prices and the Democrats and Biden's approval rating? So gas prices do have a relatively well-documented connection between presidential approval. When gas prices go up, presidential approval goes down. When gas prices go down, presidential approval goes up, though more slowly. Things that go down faster than things that go up, which also feels like how gas prices behave, actually. I think gas prices going down, which is honestly a little bit of a symbol of inflation writ large going down, definitely helps the Democrats, right? It takes sort of that main thing that's been the criticism of them, that the economy's gotten, so hot and so expensive, and it sort of takes it off the table, makes it a little less sort of, powerful of an issue. So that probably helps them. Now, does it help them enough to really change what's going to happen in the election? No, but it may change, it may soften a little bit, right? And I think that's a big part of why we're sort of going from that, having essentially an equal chance of a red wave versus moderate Republican gains to being more likely in that Republican gain territory. Isn't really about the political events that are happening. A little bit, but it's more about the fact that the economy looks like it's sort of settling down a little bit. There's a number of indicators we've seen that suggests that, from employment to prices, that the economy is kind of getting into an okay place. And if that's true, that is, generally speaking, better for the incumbents, the Democratic Party. Let's see. All right, I don't have any more questions. So, if anyone else has something they want to get in here in the last second, please do. But otherwise, I appreciate your time today for joining us. This, again, will be available on the Ipsos website. Likewise, all of the data I just talked about is available on our website. You can find it at ipsos.com/EnglishUS/news and polls. All of this is public domain research. We're certainly happy for you to use it or share it. And likewise, I'm certainly available if anyone has questions. Certainly can reach out to me. Welcome any questions or discussion. But otherwise, thank you for your time today. And we will be seeing you for our next one, which will be September 27th. That will be our next Inside Track webinar. We'll be really getting into the heart of the election season. We'll even have our own Ipsos election polls by then, so should have a lot of fun stuff to talk about with you by then. But until then, thank you and have a good day.